market is changing. Can your business keep up? Join me, Justin Lane, and a host of enterprise sales talent as we unravel the world of sales incentives and technology to help you become a more agile and effective leader. Learn how best-in-class organizations use data to identify and apply the right incentives at the right time to drive organizations towards success, whatever the market throws at you. Quit the guesswork and unlock the full potential in your sales team. Welcome to the Sales Compensation Show. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome to the show today, Mark Donnolo. I've known Mark for a number of years now. I most actively engage with him at a variety of different conferences in the space, but I'm always excited when he comes out with a new book, when his company comes out with new research, surveys in the space, because I know it's going to be thought-provoking and I know it's going to be of great quality. He also hosts a podcast that I want to give a plug for called the Rethink Sales Podcast. And so I highly encourage listeners to go check that out. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Justin. Glad to be here.
Mark, for the folks who aren't familiar with you, could you share a little bit about your background and what you're up to today?
Sure. Going back a little bit, I kind of come from a non-traditional background. If you think about something like sales effectiveness, sales compensation, I'm what you might call an art school MBA. So I started out in art school years ago in Philadelphia back in the 80s. And then I was a designer in New York in the 80s doing museum and exhibition design and corporate identity and branding. And somewhere along the way, I figured out I wanted to go to business school. I think it was because I had some roommates that were going to business school at the time and helped one of them move to a school that will remain unnamed because it later became a rival. but I thought, I want to do this. It's really interesting, this whole business thing. And so I went to business school. And then when I came out, I had to take the whole design thing and kind of, put it aside, put it in the closet because nobody wanted to hire the art guy, no serious, company. And so what I discovered years later was that there was a place where the right brain creative principles and the left brain analytics, they came together in terms of problem solving. And that place for me was really around sales effectiveness and sales compensation. So, I got into sales compensation kind of unintentionally because I started working with a firm out of business school that did marketing and sales consulting. And I thought that sounds like what I do because I was in an advertising agency and design firm before that. And we're doing this thing called sales compensation. That was most of the work we did. And I'm like, what is this thing? And so not many people really know about it. It's not like Billy says, I want to be a policeman, and Bobby says, I want to be a fireman. And I go, I want to be a sales compensation designer, right? At least it doesn't happen yet. But I came into it like a lot of people, learning about it through other means. So I realized how critical and how important sales compensation is to the business world. And it's become, a core of what I do.
Talk to me about your current firm, SalesGlobe. How do you folks help out your clients, and what's the span of how you can help?
Well, SalesGlobe is a revenue growth consulting firm. At our core, what we are is we're problem solvers around sales issues, around sales effectiveness issues, and very often those are things that have to do with go-to-market, sales organization design, sales process, and of course, sales compensation and consulting. So we are focused on not just the benchmarks and the best practices, but we're focused on how do you use that information to then begin the real job of problem solving and figuring out how we're going to develop a unique right solution for the business that we're in and how it's going to give us a competitive advantage.
So you have a book about the idea of what a CEO needs to know about sales compensation. And I think I've heard you talk a number of times about connecting strategy to sales compensation, corner office to front line. Balance this out against the idea that as I talk to a lot of companies, we have sales comp planning, we have sales comp execution, and these two things maybe sit in different business functions at different levels in the hierarchy. How should people reconcile this idea that it applies from the front line to the corner office, and then it sits in all these different places within the organization? Is there a way to streamline it, make sense of it?
Well, I think at its essence, what we're trying to do with the sales compensation program is we're trying to get a message across to the sales organization At its essence, the sales compensation program is a communications tool, right? So we want to say something to the sales organization. We want them to do something. And it'd be a whole lot easier just to pay everybody base salary and not go through all the machinations of how to design and manage sales compensation. But we do it because we're trying to get a message across. And that message is hopefully around the goals and objectives and the strategy of the business, or it could be the business unit or of the team that salesperson is working for. So when I look at kind of simplifying what we're trying to accomplish, sales compensation is not about trying to make sure people earn money or trying to make sure that we're, doing certain, detailed things in the organization. Sales compensation is trying to make sure that we're connecting the strategy to the salesperson. So the part of the strategy that they can control, they are motivated to do that. So we want to connect strategy, and we also want to make sure that it's going to be something that's going to be motivational and exciting and is going to drive behavior. So when I wrote the book, Justin, I actually wasn't interested in writing a sales compensation book because I thought, there's several sales compensation books out there and there's some pretty good ones. But what I realized was missing was a couple things. One was there wasn't anything that really talked about how to make that strategic connection, hence the title, what your CEO needs to know. It's kind of tongue in cheek, right? It's really what you need to know about sales compensation, or anybody needs to know. But a lot of companies weren't making that connection to the strategy. The other was, as sales compensation books go, they're kind of boring, right? So you get into like 40 different sales compensation plan examples, or here's how the mechanics work, whatever. And what's the first thing an executive does with that book? They give it to their analyst, right? Here you read this. I'm not going to read a bunch of commission tables and stuff. So we needed something that actually talked to leaders who are heads of sales operations, who are heads of compensation, who are heads of HR, who are heads of companies like presidents and CEOs. So we wanted to make something that was going to be accessible and talk to those leaders, not just through a bunch of numbers and tables, but through methodology and models that help you with how to think about sales compensation and how to solve the problem, not just like, here's how a commission rate works. And one of the other things we did with the book was we wrote some interesting stories to kind of tie it all together, because stories are kind of at the core of our primal wiring, right? If I can tell a story about something, I can get that message across. So hopefully we created a book that actually helps people connect to that topic on a little bit more of a human level than just a technical level.
Yeah. Gosh, so many thoughts coming out of that. First one, right? I think just recently I had a conversation with some finance folks, thinking about the idea of the ROI of sales comp. I want to take it one step back to the consulting world. When people ask you, like, what's the ROI of improving the sales compensation design? So again, this idea of a better story for the reps, as you describe it, right? Connecting the corporate strategy to the rep. What can that do for a company in terms of economic benefit?
Well, yeah, ROI, I think that's an easy one to jump onto and say, well, you're going to get this kind of revenue growth improvement based on your sales expense or sales compensation expense or whatever that may be. In the problem solving vein, what I try to do is I try to break that apart and say, okay, ROI, what is R? Well, R depends on what you want, right? We can say R is sales growth or revenue, new revenue, or whatever it might be. You could say R is we want to increase our employee retention because we have high turnover. You could say R is we want to be able to increase our growth of new strategic products, right? So the first thing that you have to do as an organization is define what is the return. And I think the typical one is how much revenue are we getting for the expense, and I would be the expense typically that you're spending on the sales compensation plan. So how much revenue are we getting for the expense? But I'm always, before I chase something down like that and say, well, here's what it should be, or here's how you should think about it, I think you have to answer those kind of questions, first of all. I think the other tricky thing about sales compensation is when you talk about ROI, sales compensation is actually part of a bigger model, right? We think about a model we use called revenue roadmap, but basically the idea is that You've got a sales strategy layer, you've got a sales coverage layer, you've got a sales enablement layer where sales compensation sits. It's hard to argue that the sales compensation plan alone drives the return on the investment or drives that revenue by itself, right? Because there's so many other things that come into play. How is our coverage model working? What's changing with our sales process, et cetera? So it's a tricky one to try to tie that in. I think that's one of the hard things about sales compensation is that it works in concert with so many other pieces.
Yeah. I've used the analogy in the past of it's a Formula One racing program. Sales comp is the racing fuel.
Yeah,
You can't
right.
win without it, but you got to have everything else. You got to have a good pit crew, good tires, great engine, to good driver to win. But I think,
Right,
yeah,
true. Yeah, and I think that's a challenge for organizations because when you talk about the team or the group that designs sales compensation or the team that manages sales compensation, they're one member of a much bigger team. So when they think about what they do as being the most important thing or the one thing, well, it's not. It's actually fits together with so many different parts. And I think that's one of the things, we all have to remember because we get so myopically focused on what we do within our own areas, particularly in a big organization.
earlier you touched on the idea briefly of what's within a seller's control or prominence, right? What can they influence on the sale? And that's kind of how we want to pay them. What's a good way for people to think about that idea? How can they better understand what a rep can control and hence design a good, metric or measure around that versus things outside of their control?
Right, right. Rather than looking at what the measures are that we've used in the past or maybe what competitors are doing, going back to that idea of connecting it to the strategy, I like to use a tool that we have called C-level goals. It's just a really simple idea of there are 5 major things that you need to identify in order to have it flow into how the sales organization work and how the work should work and how the sales compensation plan should work. And those 5 areas are: what are we doing or what do we want to do over the next year or two from a customer standpoint? So certain segments, new customer, current customer, retention, penetration, could be buyer level. So what matters from a customer standpoint? What matters from a offer or a product standpoint? Are there certain things that we want to promote more than others? Are there new offers coming out? Are there offers that we need to hold on to? What should what we should be thinking about from a coverage standpoint in terms of how the organization works, roles, that type of thing, and what we want those roles to do? And then from a talent standpoint, what do we want to do in terms of attracting and retaining the right talent? And finally, financially, what do we want to accomplish in terms of revenue, profitability, productivity, anything that might be linked financially? And so, our experience, Justin, is that if you can answer those 5 questions really clearly, and we call them C-level goals, but they're really, when we say C-level, it's for anybody that's running a piece of the business. So the head of sales, the CEO, could be the head of certain markets or regions. What's important? If you can take that and then translate that down and say, then, okay, well, what matters then for what the salesperson should be doing, or each of these sales roles, because sales roles we have different roles. And then you get to that question of, and the pivotal question for me is, out of those C-level goals that are within the purview of this particular account manager role or this account executive role, what can that person actually influence or control? And so that's when you get down to that question. And that's both an eligibility question: should they be on incentive compensation or sales compensation in the first place? But then it's also a question of what should be the most important measures that are in the plan.
Yeah. I like the methodology. I like the approach of work through the problem, versus just taking a gut feel type of thing. And I asked the question because, as you said that, I thought about something I recently heard from someone that they were, as part of their design initiative in-house, they were going to listen to some sales calls, do what I'll call a virtual ride along to try to see like what are the reps, what are they up against, what are they facing, because they were new to the company and they didn't really have a good idea of what the sales folks did at their organization.
Yeah, yeah, and that's one of the most valuable things I think you can do is get out there with the sales team. We were teaching a class with some people across a group of different companies a few weeks ago, and we got to this question of the importance of the job description, the importance of the job profile. And, the job profile really is the foundation for the incentive compensation plan, is that's what it's going to tell you what the job does. And I was like, well, no, not necessarily. What's going to tell you what the job does is you getting out there and riding along and understanding what they do. And you're going to become better informed about that. And in fact, your same job titles across the organization may be doing different things depending on the market. So yeah, to your point, you got to get out there and you got to actually be with them and see what's happening.
Before we jumped on the call, we were chatting a little bit about this idea of a body of knowledge around sales compensation. And your comment there just made me think about kind of this conventional wisdom of, trying to get to a singular plan for a singular sales job or sales role. Is this still applicable today, or is there more individualization needed to be able to, like you mentioned, recruit, motivate, and retain the individual seller versus somebody that has a title or a role?
Well, I think I wouldn't go to individualization. I guess what I would say is that we've got to be aware of what the differences are going to be, or are going to be in those jobs by specific markets or specific situations. So the philosophy I usually use is, from an effectiveness and efficiency standpoint, I mean, the optimal thing we could do is have one compensation plan for the entire world for a particular job, right? We know that's not practical. But I've worked with companies recently where they say, well, we want to be the one Acme, plug in whatever name you want. We want to be the one Acme, right? And we want the same thing happening across the organization. And then each of the regions will argue about why they have a unique situation, why we have to have a different type of compensation plan for our region, et cetera, et cetera. So we start with the assumption of consistency. And then what we do is we argue ourselves away from that on a business case basis, right? Which tends to work really well, because you say, okay, what's your case for why this should be different? And then we want to then start to say, well, what is a valid case? Well, we have differences in our customer base, or our market growth rate is different, or perhaps we've got a different generation of people that we're recruiting in this particular market, right? That could be business case. You have to decide what that is for yourself. I think it's treacherous to go to like highly individualized incentive programs, because number one, you're going to lose massive amounts of efficiency and effectiveness in the program because of so much variation. Number two, I think it introduces a lot of randomness in terms of what really is the best design, because that design then is starting to be determined by the preferences of certain people or jobs or markets, right? So I guess I'm still a proponent of where we can have consistency, that's going to be better. And where we can have simplicity, that's going to be better. And, there's this old adage, Justin, about, what should you pay for versus what should you manage to? I would argue that we could probably get to a level of, we can identify something simpler that we can pay for, and then we can be more specific in our management techniques, because there is a role for these people called sales managers, right? They have to do something, which is, it's not a remote control device in the incentive compensation plan.
Let's talk about that a little bit. So this is something that I've been engaged in a number of conversations over the past, I'll call it year. And it's one of those things where, somebody mentioned, oh, it's a pendulum, right? This concept or idea comes up every couple of years and then it kind of dies on the vine type of thing. But the idea of paying people for inputs into the selling process versus just paying people for the outputs or the performance of close won business. Any thoughts or philosophy on if, on one side of the equation, we have a plan designed around just pure activities. On the other side, it's just pure X revenue up against X commission rate. Is there a middle ground, or do we have to pick one side or the other of this equation?
Yeah, I think that we have all sorts of rules and guidelines and things in sales compensation. And I think those are good, and I think those are helpful, but I think they can also hinder us over time, because the reality is the world is changing and the markets are changing. And one of the best things you can do, I think, in sales compensation is know the rules and then break them, right? And that's actually a healthy thing. So we have done a number of programs where we have paid on inputs, but you have to bring it back to the question of why would you pay on an input versus a result? I mean, the classic situation, or the classic rule really is you pay for results and you manage to the activities. And if you're in a highly transactional process, that might make sense. I was talking with a company the other night, global professional services company, and they said one of the challenges we're having is that we have these mega deals that we're trying to close, and even some of the mid-sized deals. And these things are in, $50 million and above in size. So they're monster deals. And what's happening is that our people, they will find the opportunity and then they'll have a challenge qualifying it. But the big challenge is that they try to jump too quickly to getting to that proposal and trying to win the opportunity. And it turns out that they don't really go through the process of solving the problem for the customer, and they end up giving them the wrong type of proposal, or they end up mispricing it or something like that, because they are so motivated to get to the win, right? So we're paying on results in that situation. That kind of situation is one in which you could say there are certain milestones along the way that are important for us in terms of a process that we want people to do those things. And then that's going to actually give us a better result at the end. So long-term deals, complex deals, especially that can come into play. And so if you're, hypothetically looking at over a year-long sales process, could be a year and a half or 2-year sales process, you want the person to be motivated and rewarded. Well, you could say, I'm going to pay them all base salary, or you could say part of their incentive is going to be doing the things that are going to carry that deal along correctly. And it may be certain prototype levels, it may be certain letters of interest, it may be certain commitments from the client, but usually what it is, they are customer recognized milestones that cannot be just kind of fabricated by the sales team. So I see that, there is a place where you can use those, and it can actually be more effective than the final result alone. So that doesn't say that in that plan you wouldn't pay for the final result, but you're actually paying for activities along the way.
I was at a conference recently speaking. I was describing kind of my journey over the last 20 years thinking about sales compensation. And I said 20 years ago, to me, it was a math problem to solve, right? I was thinking about rates and total targets and, trying to design something that was a math model, right? Trying to solve it. I think over the, ensuing decades, as I got more interested in behavioral economics and reading about how people make decisions, and just talking to more people, I realized, hey, at the end of every sales compensation plan, there's a person, right? And so how do you bring in this humanistic side to it? And then more recently, and I won't pick on, the company that kind of triggered my thought around this, was the idea that you have to think about the prospect or customer or client as well. Mm-hmm. And what you just described to me is this idea for me of what kind of buying experience, are you providing through the story you're telling the reps of a compensation plan that you're trying to deliver? And the idea, if it's too aggressive, or, they're only paying them on outputs, they're going to deliver a very different experience, for this $50 million deal, right, than they would if you're, providing cash flow on some things that are happening over the course of a natural buying cycle for that engagement. So as you described, I don't know if that resonates with you at all. Have you thought about comp? Have you thought about comp changed in since you started doing it?
Yeah, I think a few things have changed. We were talking earlier, Justin, and I think one thing that changes naturally for someone like you or someone like me is just our experience in the market, right? So we do start off, like most people, I think, a little bit more fundamentally. It's about what are the best practices on sales compensation, and how do you set a pay mix, and how do you do the calculations? And you almost approach it from a mechanical standpoint. Think about it like golf, right? Okay, here's how you hold the club. Here's how your grip works, the backswing, keep your head down, all this kind of stuff. So you're all about the mechanics in the beginning. And then as the years pass by, what you start to do is you put those mechanics into your muscle memory, right? So we know how to do these things. And you start to move to a higher order, which is, how do I actually think about people, like you said, and behaviors? For me, the big one is, how do I think about solving the right problem, not just using the benchmarks of the best practices? And so then pan out a little bit broader view from individuals like us. I think in the world of sales compensation over the past 10 years, 20 years, I'd say, yes, things have evolved. I think technology certainly has had massive evolution in terms of the technology and systems around sales compensation. I think that the business world and the sales world has evolved. And we're looking at just even the past few years, how we've gone from heavy field sales organizations to now we have, a lot of remote and hybrid, but we also have this thing called omni-channel, right? So customers want to buy across multiple channels seamlessly. We want salespeople to be able to work across those channels to provide the right customer experience seamlessly. So we have a number of things that have changed, or so many things that have changed in terms of the business and the sales world and the sales motion. My personal opinion is sales compensation has not evolved to that same degree, to that same speed. And my frustration is that when I go to the conferences, when I talk to clients, when I hear, consultants speak, it sounds like I'm hearing the same things I heard 10 years ago. And I'm like, well, okay, where are the new ideas? Where's the new thinking? I've seen all these charts over and over again in different iterations. And so I think collectively what we need to do when you talk about body of knowledge is we need to say, okay, these are all of the accepted principles or best practices. That's fine. Now, as a larger group, as a larger business community, we need to start to move to the level of how do we start to use this in our thinking to become better problem solvers? That's a lot harder to do because that involves creative thinking. It's, again, switching from kind of that left brain analytical to the right brain. Okay, like I said before, return on investment. What is return, right? We have to ask these questions. Omni-channel, we want the right customer experience. Well, what is customer experience? And how does sales compensation relate to that? So, there's not a one clear answer for that, but we have to think of ourselves as problem solvers. And here's the biggest reason why. And this is sales compensation, and I think it's across other disciplines as well. When you look at sales comp as an example, your incentive compensation management systems and performance management systems, we've been able to automate so much in incentive compensation, right? You could say that at some point, Justin, we'll be able to automate even how to design a sales compensation plan. Enter your problem here, your parameters, and it's going to give you the answer, right? We could get there. The one thing that can't be automated or AI'd or offshored, though, is our ability to creatively solve problems. So that is one of the most important reasons that we as a community need to become better creative problem solvers using the tools, that body of knowledge that we've developed over the years. So I think that's just it's a much bigger leap to take, but that's just kind of the feeling I have as I look at how things have evolved over the years and where we are right now.
Yeah. No, I'll be interested to see, like, even this idea of AI, right? The science fiction fan of me says, oh, it's going to get there, right?
Yeah.
I think the pragmatic reality that I live in day to day, I'm like, the idea of corporate context, the sales culture, some of these things, these human ideas, I think are going to be difficult to bridge from this idea of data and best practices and trying to connect those two things. Like that's where I think the person will still have a role for some time to come.
Yeah. How do you enter corporate culture into a computer? I don't know.
I'm sure somebody's probably working on the problem right now.
I'm sure you have 26 variations of corporate culture, so you could pick one of those, I suppose. But
yeah,
you're right. There are these things that you can't know unless you get out there. We talked about the job descriptions earlier and the ride-alongs. And one of our people, actually a couple of people are in one market this week in Denver doing ride-alongs with one of our clients. And I asked him how it was going. And this one guy who's been working a lot remote and hybrid, and he's used to be on the road all the time. And he's totally dedicated to remote and hybrid now in his mind. And he said, Mark, it makes a huge difference to be riding along with these reps in the truck, visiting customers. He said, you learn so much that you can't learn just on a Zoom call. And I'm like, bingo. Yeah, we're humans. I mean, you can't just enter some value into a computer. That's part of the problem solving equation.
Yeah. So I'm going to tee something up, and it's going to take a second, but it's something I've been thinking about recently. And it came out of the World at Work conference in August, where there was a panel at the end, and somebody from the audience asked about, had they been hearing about it? How are they applying the idea of DEI into sales compensation? And it made me think about this, concept of, an equal earning opportunity, not equity, but an equal earning opportunity.
Right.
And a multi-generational sales force where this concept of fairness seems to be becoming more important as we get more generations down the road.
Mm-hmm.
Balanced out against the idea, right, of what I've seen over the years and from doing data analysis of everything from the Pareto principle of 20% of the sellers are generating 80% of the revenue. And I'd even go so far as, a different statistic of 10% of the sellers are probably bringing in approximately 50% of the revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is differentiated performance
Mm-hmm.
in sales. I think you might have been the first person I ever heard use the term reverse Robin Hood principle,
Right.
or
Yeah.
robbing from the poor and giving to the rich.
I think we coined that one in the book. Yeah.
Yeah. And so how do people think about, again, balancing out these ideas of, we have, inertia or people trying to care about equality and equity around pay. At the same time, the reality of not everybody can perform at the same level within any job.
Right.
Sales is just more, I think, transparent because we have the data of what they're producing. How do people reconcile this idea, or is it possible?
Well, I think the beautiful thing about sales is that, let's talk about equity. First of all, give me a territory that has enough potential and is comparable to the territories that the rest of the reps have in my organization. Give me the products to sell that are comparable, and give me a level playing field. Your DE&I comes after that, which is you go out and perform. We don't need to equalize the playing field beyond that, because it's then up to your talents and your capabilities, right? So I think when we start to bring DE&I into sales compensation, I think we start to dilute it down about what it really is. Sales compensation is about performance. And I've seen people from every background do really well in sales because of who they are as individuals, right? It's about them, and it's about their connection to the customer. So that's the purity of sales, I think, which is it is a pure performance situation. Now, if you said, well, my territory is not large enough, it doesn't have enough potential. Okay, those are fair arguments. That would not be a fair situation. But all things remaining constant in that area, I think the beauty is that it's really up to the individual, and it's one of the last pure, I think, performance places that we have. By the way, we just did a podcast on the Rethink Sales podcast on pay transparency. And how does that relate to performance? Now, that's going to be for jobs that go beyond sales as well, but some ideas there that it's not just about everybody has to be leveled out or equaled out in terms of being in a pay band, but it creates visibility, and it creates then the conversation about, well, if you want to be at the midpoint or the high end of that pay band, here's what you need to do that, because it could be that pay transparency starts to convert general employee pay to something that's more performance related, because now we can talk about performance and how you can move up in the band, and it's no longer hidden in the background.
Yep, I'll have to check it out. Pay transparency is something I'm very interested in and near and dear to my heart, because it was such a foreign concept to me growing up. I was raised by my grandparents for a large part of my upbringing. And the idea of asking my grandfather how much he made for work never would have crossed my mind, type of thing. Where now I think people are pretty, again, multi-generation people are pretty open and transparent about the idea, amongst from peers, what they're making. And so how do companies, and then respond to how transparent should they be, from the company to the employee relationship. But so we'll have to check out the podcast. Don't give away the secrets.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
But I think you got a great point about the generational thing, because I came from, a similar generation where you just didn't talk about those things. And, I think pay transparency laws are not saying you have to tell everybody what people are making. You just have to say, here's what this job pays in the market, right? Here's the price of this job. Okay, great. And then you get to another level of, okay, what does an individual make? I think that's a different conversation.
Yeah. Or one last topic, 2 questions I'd like to ask everybody that appears on the show. Last topic, SalesGlobe recently released a survey on sales compensation.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll have to add in some links for people to go check it out to the episode. But there's a ton of interesting findings. Like every slide, as I forwarded through the PDF, I'm like, oh, there's a gem, there's a diamond.
Yeah.
I went through a whole range of emotions as I read the results. And I got to one page where it talked about a high percentage of companies still have a cap in their compensation plan.
Right.
And, surprisingly high. And I'm like, what is leading people to continue down this path of something that I don't know. I'll ask first, what's your thought on caps? But two, something I would not consider best practice personally. Why are so many companies still doing it?
I think one is there's a cultural component, right? And so there's one question that you can ask an executive in an organization to kind of get a beat on that culture. And that question is, would it be okay if your top performing rep in a given year made more than the president of the company in terms of cash, right? And you get an immediate visceral reaction like, oh yeah, that would be awesome. We would love that, right? The hero story, all that kind of thing. Or, oh, that wouldn't be quite appropriate, And so you kind of so one thing is you get this cultural thing about how much somebody should be able to earn. The other one I think is financial. Okay, we need to make sure we're protected so we don't blow out the compensation plan if somebody really performs at a high level. We are not proponents of caps. We think, caps don't need to be in the plan. There are other devices, other ways you can certainly do that. I think the danger point on caps, Justin, is they're largely psychological. I think everything comes back to like animal metaphors, which is pay caps. Free range chickens can teach us about pay caps, right? So if you think about a chicken in a cage, right, and that cage is kind of close and around them, that's the pay cap, right? They can see that cap. And they're thinking about that, and it's kind of bothering them that it's there, right? So you're psychologically affecting the rep. In fact, when you ask a rep about a cap in the plan, a lot of times they'll say, oh yeah, there's a cap on the plan and we hate it. And, well, have you ever hit the cap? Well, no, I've never hit the cap. Do you know anybody who's hit the cap? Well, there was a guy 3 years ago that hit the cap, right? So it's on their minds though, right? So you've got this little cage, right? But then the free range chicken, well, the free range chicken doesn't have that cap. It doesn't have the cage right there. It doesn't have the bars. But the free range chicken is aspirational. It feels like it can do anything. Although we all know there's a fence out there somewhere, right? Because it can't run out to the road, right? So to say that you don't need a cap, you can do other things. And actually, when we look at the survey results that you mentioned, companies are decreasing the use of caps, but they're doing other things, right? So they're putting in a little bit more on regressive rates to say the plan's going to slow down at a certain point. Okay, well, that's a little bit different, right? So people can still get paid more. Or we're going to be doing something in terms of bluebird policies or mega deal policies, so that if something came in and you really didn't have heavy influence over it, that might be taken outside the plan. Or if it was a mega deal that would blow the plan out, that might go to a separate commission rate. So there are other ways to do it other than putting a cap on the plan. Because I think the psychological effect of that cap is greater than the benefit you get by having it.
Yeah. No. And again, fantastic survey. There was 30 things like that I read up. That was one that, jumped off the page at me for sure. All right, last two questions, Mark. First one, who in the world of sales compensation would you most like to take to lunch?
I've probably had lunch with so many people in the world of sales compensation already, but I think who I would like to take to lunch in the world of sales compensation is probably not in the world of sales compensation. They're probably in the world of business more broadly, and that whole idea of, connecting the strategy to compensation. And it would be somebody who has been kind of a serial business builder, right? Somebody like Richard Branson or Elon Musk that have been able to build multiple companies because they've been able to do something, which is they've been able to create the business model. They've been able to work it through those revenue roadmap components of the market and the coverage model. And they've had to motivate people, whether they've been involved directly in the sales compensation plan themselves or not. A lot of times they have because they worked in sales, initially. My questions for them would be around, how did you do that? How did you make all those things work? How did you make those connection points work? Because for me, sales compensation, the solution is not a better sales compensation plan. The solution is how do we connect to the overall business and how do we motivate people to get there, right? And that's a bigger question than just sales compensation.
Last question. If you can tell from what's behind me here, I like to read, and I'm always looking for recommendations on what's next. What's one book you could recommend to the audience? Either broad business, revenue, sales management, or down to, sales effectiveness, sales comp, that people should go read to get some new ideas?
I think it's really important to read beyond your area of expertise. And I talk about on the podcast the value of becoming a student of history or being a student of history, that, if you learn about broader topics, broader history, whatever it might be, it gives you so many more what I call hooks of knowledge to hang other knowledge on, and that can expand your knowledge, right? So if you read something in another topic area, it's going to help you to think about sales compensation, better. In the area of business, one book, and there's so many, but one book I thought of was this book called Performing Under Pressure, and I read it a few years ago. Henry Weisinger is the author of that book. There's actually a couple of authors. And what was so good about that book was it took so many of the things that we deal with in business in terms of those pressure moments, that big presentation, that deal I have to win, and it deals with it psychologically. Like, how should you think about that? And the idea that there are no must-win moments, right? There's really buildups of things, and you get multiple swings, right? And the idea that how do you get yourself into a mental state that when you walk in and you go to present to the board, you go to present the new sales comp plan or whatever it might be to the board, how do you get yourself in a state where you're actually being yourself and you're enjoying that and you're being your best self in front of them versus feeling like you're under this massive amount of pressure. So it's that's a great book. Probably the other one I would recommend would be Atomic Habits, and that's by James Clear. And Atomic Habits is just about the day-to-day habits that you build. That's a very recent book, but both, kind of good self-help books. And then, of course, for anybody that hasn't read the new book I put out called Quotas with an exclamation point, that's a great one about, and I'll say so myself, a great one about how do you connect your compensation program and your sales program to the goals of the business, and how do you balance out market opportunity and sales capacity? Of course, very much closer into the topic that we're talking about. But those other two, I think, are really good, kind of good mind books and thinking books that can, help you change your day-to-day life.
Nice. Yeah, thank you so much. The first two I'm not familiar with. I'll definitely have to check out for sure. Your book I'm more familiar with. We're at the end of our time together. I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming on the show. I know you are pulled in a million directions between clients and the running of an organization and the creative endeavors that you have. And so from, a very sincere place, thank you so much for your time today. And I will let you get back to it.
Awesome, Justin. Thank you. Always enjoy talking with you. Thanks for the opportunity.